We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen.
Welcome back. I'm Brandon, author of the book Bound in Lies, The Biblical Case Against Slavery. And in this video, we're going to tackle a lot. So buckle up and get ready, because this one's going to be a long one. Now, about 2 weeks ago, we posted our video on Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 and 21. And we dealt with some of the misconceptions and misinformation that gets spread about those two verses. And I did my best to go through those passages and bring some clarity and truth to them. Now, as expected, we did get a few controversial comments in the comments section, but not many people actually brought that passage into their argument, and I'm assuming that's because we actually did a pretty good job of shedding some light on it. However, there was one particular passage that was mentioned multiple times by multiple users, and that is Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 and 46. Again, if you know anything about the issue of biblical slavery, then this passage sticks out like a sore thumb, and you know exactly where this conversation is getting ready to go. But if you're not an expert in the topic of biblical slavery, and it's not something that you've spent a lot of time studying, then I think you're going to find this video extremely helpful and interesting. Now, the one particular comment that we're going to use as our springboard into the conversation was left by a user. I'm probably going to butcher this, but Sin Gustus. And he didn't have so much questions as he did a comment. But his comment, I think, kind of reflects the overarching narrative that was taken from multiple different comments that were left in the section. And so I posted our video last week about giving voice to the opposition and how important that is. We never want to be afraid to confront tough questions and give voice to the opposition. And so I did let him know in the comments section that I would be using his particular comment as the springboard into our conversation this week. And I can only hope that he's here joining us and watching this video. And he said, "The Bible condones and promotes chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is defined as the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work. Another definition is the condition in which one person is owned as property by another and is under the owner's control, especially in involuntary servitude." He goes on to quote Leviticus 25, verses 44 to 46, which we're going to look at in depth in a few minutes. He then goes on to say, under Mosaic law, foreign slaves were chattel slaves. Their enslavement was based upon their ethnic heritage. There were no regulations on the treatment of chattel slaves. They could be bought, sold, separated from their families, beaten, raped, killed, kept for life, and passed down as inherited property. Every specific reference to foreign slaves in the Bible exists to deny them rights and protections afforded to Hebrew slaves. The treatment of foreign slaves was every bit as bad or even worse than slavery in the antebellum South. If you have to lie to defend your beliefs, it is time to get new beliefs. No more filters, no more lies, please. So that is quite the list of claims. And so what we wanted to do was take that claim and start working through it and seeing if it can hold any weight under scrutiny, or if the foundations of his claims start to crumble once we start investigating it. Before we go any further, though, I would like to ask if you find our videos helpful, insightful, or even engaging, if you could just take a minute and like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. It really does a lot to help our videos move through the algorithms and reach more people, help bring them the truth and clarity they need to defend some of the hardest and misunderstood passages in the Old Testament. But now that we've gotten through that, what we do need to do is take a minute and look at the particular passage that this user is referencing, and that is found in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46. Now, in his comment, he actually quoted from the King James Version, but what I'm going to do is use the NIV because it actually uses more harsh language. And what I don't want to happen is for somebody to say, well, you used a particular version that didn't even mention the word slave, or you tried to downplay the severity of the passage by using a translation that was worded differently. So we're going to take the translation that has the most harsh language because the truth never has to worry about facing scrutiny. And to the user who left the comment, if you are watching this video, then you already know truth doesn't need a spin, doesn't need a filter, it just needs to be heard. So what we're going to do is walk through the text together, no shortcuts, no dodging. And if you're open to more than just cliches, and you're not afraid to hold your own belief up to the evidence, then I would encourage you to watch this series in full and to not be afraid of the truth inside the text. Now, if we do go to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46, we read, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So this is obviously something that we cover very in depth in the book. And so if we pull up a small excerpt from the book, we can read, "This represents the second argument put forth by the prosecution, claiming that the Bible supports slavery. Their argument suggests that in this passage, God is instituting and commanding chattel slavery, a form of slavery that closely mirrors the transatlantic slave trade of modern history. According to their argument, God allegedly instructs the Israelites to capture or purchase slaves from surrounding nations, allowing them to keep these individuals in a state of perpetual servitude, stripping them of their rights, and thereby fulfilling the definition of slavery as we know it." And that fits almost exactly line for line with the claim and accusation made by our user on YouTube. Now, in order to discuss this passage, we need to actually go back and look at multiple different things. And so, like I said from the beginning, this video is going to be a long one. And so I may actually end up breaking this into parts because I don't want the video to become so long and so intense that people lose interest in it. I want to make sure that you're able to digest the information, contemplate it, and process it. Having said that, we'll see how it goes and we'll see where we get to as we go on. First thing that I think we need to establish is what the actual definition of a slave is. And I don't think we hold any different definition than what the user holds himself, because it actually seems to be the same definition that we use in the book and that we follow in the book. And that comes from the Oxford Language Dictionary, which describes a slave as a person who is forced to work for and obey another and is considered to be their property, an enslaved person. BBC News also describes a slave as the ownership, buying, and selling of human beings for the purpose of forced and unpaid labor. Now, I think it's fair to say that this fits with the description that the user mentioned. And so, for argument's sake, we just want to make sure that we're on the same page of what the definition of a slave is. Moving on, the next thing we need to talk about is the ways that laws govern society, how they work, and how they interconnect and intertwine with each other. For example, just because a law already exists and a new law is introduced in the future that offers clarification for that particular law, it doesn't negate the original law. That's not how it works in our legal system. It's never the way it's worked in society, and it's never the way it's worked in any ancient society. So to give you an example or an analogy, if you work for a company and the HR department decides to put a rule in the handbook saying that the dress code is to be professional, everybody generally understands what that means. However, if next year a new law is introduced that says workers are required to wear polos, that doesn't mean that the next day you get to show up to work in your pajamas or your underwear just wearing a polo shirt. The original rule of professional dress still stands, and the second rule was only implemented to help clarify it. This is also how it works in our legal system. You could take, for example, the law of stopping at a red traffic light. While this law stands, there's another law adding clarification saying that you can legally make a right turn at a red traffic light. Now, the clarification law saying that you can make a right turn at a red traffic light doesn't supersede the original law, which says you must stop at a red traffic light. Now, even though they are technically two different laws describing two different circumstances, they come together to form something called the whole of the law. And this is something that's very important when we look at ancient biblical texts. You could also take, for example, shoplifting. Laws generally state that shoplifting is a crime and it's considered theft. However, there's additional laws that clarify it, saying that shoplifting something with a value under $500 is considered a misdemeanor and may not result in jail time. That doesn't negate the original law that shoplifting is a crime. It just offers clarification on how certain instances of shoplifting are to be handled. Again, this is the same way that biblical law tends to work when we read from the beginning to the end. We get a core command that generally always remains true, but then we're introduced later on to additional laws that offer clarification around that core principle. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is context. Now, inevitably, anytime I mention the word context, there's someone who says something along the lines of, "Great, I can't wait to hear in what context slavery is okay or justified." And I can't even begin to explain how ignorant of a statement that is. It's not only intellectually dishonest, but it's a statement that's devoid of all logic and reasoning. Context is everything. Again, if we just offer an illustration or an example, if a homeowner is in his home and an intruder breaks in, and that intruder holds the man's family at gunpoint and threatens their lives, if that homeowner somehow gets free and a struggle ensues with the intruder, and during the course of the struggle the intruder becomes deceased, but then when the story is reported, the headline reads, "Homeowner kills man who walked in his home," and it has no mention of the man being an intruder, holding the family at gunpoint, threatening their lives, or the struggle that ensued in self-defense. The only thing mentioned in the story is that the homeowner killed the man for walking in his home. Would we say that that was intellectually dishonest, or that it was devoid of all logic and reasoning? Yeah, of course we would, because it's only giving a portion of the story and intentionally isolating out a section of the narrative that fits the agenda that the reporter wants to write. It doesn't offer a true account of what actually happened. It's taking the events that transpired and the ending result out of context and painting a completely different picture of what actually happened. And that's the danger that we run into when we deal with biblical texts and we choose to isolate certain portions of the narrative out of context and we ignore all the surrounding texts, either in front of or after it, that tell the entire story and give the narrative for where that statement is found. Now, here's the thing. I've been doing this for a long time, and typically, not always, but typically, the people who are most afraid of talking about context are the ones who are most afraid of what kind of truths come to light when context is discovered. It's like going back to when you were kids and you and your sibling got into a fight and you ran to mom and dad and you said, "So and so punched me." And they'll ask, "Well, why did he punch you?" And you don't want to talk about it. And that's usually because the reason you got punched was because you were instigating or starting trouble. So you try to ignore the context of the situation so that you're able to control the flow of the narrative. So just to recap, we've clarified what the definition of a slave actually was, which we agree on. We've also discussed the entirety of the law and how important it is to consider that one law that's introduced later on doesn't supersede a law that was brought in before that period, but rather they go together to form the entirety of the law. And lastly, we've also talked about context and how isolating a single statement outside of a narrative that it's designed to be inside of can result in a completely distorted picture of the actual events that transpired. Now we get to what a lot of people would consider the boring part of the video. We actually have to go back and look at the biblical law that was given in Exodus and Leviticus prior to this narrative being spoken, so we can understand what kind of foundational laws were already in place and what kind of clarifying laws were already in place before we ever get to this section. If we go back to Exodus, we can start in chapter 20, where we read, "But the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or your daughter, nor your male or female slaves, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in the towns." So here we actually have a command given that all slaves, along with the entire community, was given a day of rest every week on the Sabbath, where no work was allowed to be performed. So about 2 weeks ago, we put out a video on Exodus chapter 21, where we discussed in depth a lot of the laws that were in place in that chapter that were introduced as protections for the people of Israel, whether they were men, women, slaves, or free. We talked about why each individual law was given, the importance of the way that it was phrased and why it was given the way that it was, and what each law meant to each individual group of people. We're not going to take another 20 minutes to go over this entire section, but what we can do is hit the bullet points real quick. If we look at verse 12, it says, "Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place that I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death." So here we have a command that anybody who murders somebody else is to be put to death. The text makes no distinction between men, women, slaves, or free. It simply says that if somebody kills somebody else, regardless of their standing in society, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whether they're man, whether they're woman, whether they're slave, whether they're free, that the killer is to be put to death. This is also where we find verse 16, where we read, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." Now, skeptics will claim that this verse in particular doesn't expressly condemn the practice of slavery, and they're right. We can agree on that. This particular verse doesn't expressly condemn the practice of slavery. However, what it does say is that you can't kidnap somebody and force them into slavery against their will. You can't sell them to somebody else, nor can you buy them, because kidnapping them and selling them to somebody else is guilty of death. And even if you had nothing to do with the kidnapping, but you're the person who purchases them from somebody else and they don't want to go with you against their will, then you're still guilty of the same crime and it's punishable by death. Now, 2 weeks ago, when we did our video in Exodus chapter 20, we explained that the word punished is the word avenged, or nakal, which is the Hebrew word expressly given for vengeance in blood, meaning that if you killed your slave by beating them with a rod, then you were to be punished, and somebody in the community would be designated as the avenger of blood and was responsible for enacting vengeance on the master to avenge the slave by killing him. So this verse expressly says that if a master kills their slave by beating them to death, then the master will be put to death as well. However, if the slave doesn't die from the beating, then the master can't be put to death because of previous laws that were given, which we also discussed in our video 2 weeks ago, called an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This means that life couldn't be taken because the master didn't take the life of the slave. And as we flow through the narrative, what we find is proportional justice, meaning that the damage that was caused to the slave by the master needed to be given out in equal measure to the master, mainly in the freeing of the slave from any debt obligation that they had to the master, where they were granted immediate emancipation. And we read that in verse 26. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Now, in verse 32, we actually have a very interesting verse, and a lot of skeptics try to spin this in a way that says that this is how we know that what the price of a slave was. It was 30 shekels of silver. In verse 32, we read, if a bull gores a male or female slave, then the owner of the bull must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. Problem with this statement and this claim is that at the very least, it's born out of complete ignorance, and at worst, it's intentionally misleading. If we rewind and we actually read the previous 4 verses, then we're left with a very clear and very concise picture of what the actual issue was and what the law was trying to convey. If a man owned an ox, and that ox killed any man or woman, then the ox was to be put to death for the killing, but the owner of the ox was not to be automatically held responsible because it could have been an accident. And we read that in verse 28. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. This is our foundational law. Moving forward with verse 29, we start getting our clarifying laws that intertwine with the foundational law to start forming the whole of the law. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it penned up and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned and its owner also is to be put to death. So now the narrative changes. If a man or a woman is killed, and the owner was warned in the past that his ox had a tendency towards behavior like this, and instead of addressing it, he chose to do nothing and ignore the problem, then he was now held liable because he had an opportunity to stop this from happening, but instead chose to do nothing. And so, if the ox killed a man or a woman, and it had been shown to have tendencies towards that in the past, and the owner did nothing about it, not only was the bull put to death, but the owner was put to death as well. But verse 30 continues on with some additional clarification. If this situation presents itself, and the owner is held liable and is facing the death penalty, then the family of the deceased had the legal right to demand payment from the owner of the livestock as compensation for their loss. And the only way out of the situation was that he had to pay them what they demanded. Verse 31 then says that this law also applies if it happens to a son or a daughter. Now, this verse is actually extremely interesting. A lot of people don't even realize what they just read. They kind of breeze right over the verse. But if you noticed, it mentions both men and women here. One of the strongest claims that is shouted from the rooftops is that women in the Old Testament were seen as inferior to men. Their lives didn't share the same inherent value, and so women were allowed to be abused. They were allowed to be mistreated. They were allowed to be essayed, and there really was no consequences, and there weren't any legal laws or protections for women in that time. However, this verse puts an emphasis on the life of the woman. It shows us that a woman's life wasn't any less valuable than that of a man, and that a man's life wasn't any more valuable than that of a woman. because this law applied equally to both sexes, and it shows us that the same inherent value to life was present whether you were male or female. Now, verse 32 starts to offer some additional clarification. What happens in the event that this is an accident, but it happens to somebody else's slave? So we talked about this a little bit back in the video that we covered on Exodus. But back in those times, slaves were typically people who fell on very hard and destitute times. They didn't have the money or the resources to be able to live, and they had creditors coming after them because they owed them money. Think modern day bankruptcy. So what would happen is an individual, when they became destitute, they would approach a wealthy individual or a benefactor, and they would basically offer to sell their labor services to that individual in exchange for them to pay off their creditors and their debts. The situation that arises here is that even though this is an accident and the previous law said that the owner wouldn't be held liable, it doesn't change the fact that this was somebody else's slave. And they had probably invested a good portion of their income and a good portion of their finances in securing their labor services by paying off creditors and debtors that were after them. And now, because of the unexpected passing of the slave, they would never see that return on their investment. So back in those days, we don't know exactly, but what we do know is that 30 shekels of silver was worth approximately 4 months worth of wages. And so even though this was an accident, it doesn't negate the fact that it had severely altered somebody else's life because they had put out money and made an investment in this individual, and they were counting on their labor to be able to earn that money back. So the 30 shekels of silver wasn't the cost or the payment of the slave. It was a penalty or a fine imposed on the owner due to the financial loss that the other person experienced. Think modern day law. If you had a pet dog that had never shown any tendencies towards anger or aggression, but one day for some reason randomly got upset and decided to maul another individual to death, then even though somebody lost their life, you would not be able to be charged with murder because there was no intent and there was no premeditation behind it. You also wouldn't be able to be charged with manslaughter because there was no way you could have prevented it, and there was no way you could have potentially known that your animal would do something like that. But what the court system could do is fine you with civil penalties, and you may potentially spend some time in jail, or you may have to pay a penalty or a fine to the individual's family in order to compensate them for their loss. That's the exact scenario that we see playing out in Exodus. Because this was an accidental death, the owner couldn't be held liable for murder because it was an unforeseen event that nobody could have anticipated. However, that doesn't mean that he got off scot-free. He still had to compensate the owner of the slave for the lost investment, and he was imposed a fine or a penalty. In modern day times, if a court imposed a fine of, let's say, $30,000 to an individual because of that circumstance, would we then assume that $30,000 was the value of the life of that person? No, of course we wouldn't, and that would actually be pretty ridiculous. We would all understand that even though this was an accident, there still has to be a penalty assessed because somebody experienced loss. And so when an individual attempts to use verse 32 to say that slaves could be bought for the price of 30 shekels of silver, it's nothing short of an attempt to isolate a verse outside of its narrative context in order to support an already pre-held bias and belief. So just to briefly recap, if we go back to Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, we get our foundational law. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. If we then move forward into Exodus, we get our complementary and clarifying laws. It was explicitly prohibited under biblical law to kidnap an individual for the purpose of enslavement. Likewise, it was also a capital offense to purchase a slave who had been forcibly taken or to sell someone into involuntary servitude. Even ignorance of the crime was not an acceptable defense, for merely possessing a slave who had been unlawfully taken, regardless of how they were acquired, was punishable by death. In essence, all service had to be entirely voluntary and entered into of the slave by their own free will. The law mandated that slaves be treated with justice and dignity, ensuring that they were afforded legal rights and humane treatment under the established legal system. The same laws that applied to natural-born Israelite citizens who were slaves was also extended to foreigners. This ensured that all individuals, regardless of their heritage, were granted equal protection under the law. Even foreigners were permitted to own property, and they were granted the right to repurchase or redeem any land they had sold previously within a minimum redemption period of 12 months. The law strictly prohibited the mistreatment of slaves, providing legal recourse against masters who engaged in brutality or excessive force. If a slave suffered an injury, they were entitled to just compensation, which could include financial restitution for lost wages or time needed for recovery. They were also entitled to their freedom from any debt service should the injury come from their master. Every slave, regardless of their nationality, was entitled to a full day of rest on the Sabbath, just as any other member of the community. They were strictly prohibited from performing any work on this day of rest. And if a slave felt like they were being treated unjustly, they had the legal right to leave their service and seek refuge elsewhere. Furthermore, it was strictly forbidden for anyone to capture and return a runaway slave to their previous master. Instead, the law mandated that the individual be allowed to settle in any town of their own choosing, where the community was then required to provide support and protection for them. Now, while this isn't a comprehensive list of all the laws that we find in the Old Testament regarding slavery, it does give us a core foundation to rest our case on. We have our core foundational laws, and then we have our complementary and clarifying laws. And if you go back and watch our video on Exodus chapter 20, and if you've made it all the way through this video, then I think it's safe to say it's very easy to see the historical narrative that's trying to be conveyed through the laws that are established. We see an initial foundational law time and time again, and then we see additional laws introduced as complementary and clarifying laws that intertwine and all trace back to our original foundational law. It's no accident that when we read through the laws and the chapters, we see a very concise, very organized, very ordered set of laws. So that's going to do it for this week's video. And I know a lot of people who are watching are sitting there thinking, wait, you didn't even get to Leviticus 25. And I completely understand that. What we needed to do was establish some foundations so that moving forward, we can now evaluate Leviticus for what it actually says and the context in which it's given. Without establishing a baseline, such as having an agreement on what the definition of a slave is, understanding how each of the laws coincide and intertwine with each other, and move from a base foundational law to more complementary and clarifying laws, and also understand how isolating a single text outside of a historical narrative can paint a false picture in terms of the events that actually transpired, we're now ready to look at Leviticus 25. And we're going to be doing that next week. I hope you can join us for that video. Now, before we go, I want to take one last minute and ask you if you could do me a huge favor, and that is if you did find this video either helpful or insightful, if you could take a minute and like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Give me any questions you have, and let us know what topic you'd like us to cover after this series is completed. Until next week, have a great weekend.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen. Yeah, you best believe.
And hey, Singustus, if you are watching this video, I'm sorry that I didn't really get to address your specific claims tonight. This wasn't a cop-out. The video just got to be a little bit long, and I had to lay down the foundation and the baseline for what we're going to be addressing next week as we tackle Leviticus 25. So I hope you're able to join us because we are going to be tackling your claims one by one and going through each one specifically. So until then, I hope you're able to join us, and now we're done.